All right, thank you for joining today's conversation about our budget. I'm going to walk through a number of things, but first I want to deal with some of the narratives that we've been confronting. For years we've been hearing about the failing system and these kinds of things. So let me just put some details out there to start. Harford County was first in growth for English language arts reading in grades 3 through 8 this year. We were fourth in growth for math across the state. We've seen SAT scores, participation and performance go up. Advanced placement, participation and success rate on the tests go up. Apprenticeships, we lead the state in apprenticeships and other access directly into careers, something we've been working very hard on. There are few measures where we're not going the right direction, but not only going the right direction, but to some degree in the top portion of the state in terms of our movement. The work we're doing academically has been very successful. We are moving the right direction. Now, other narratives. Our request in the budget this year, our needs are great. We're looking at the start at a $60 million number just to keep our operations consistent with previous years. And this, again, runs us into another narrative. Our county executive just recently went to the media and made a statement that the school system should be able to operate on what it's gotten in past years. And anyone who knows anything about budgets understands that flat funding always leads to cutting. Costs are rising in everything. So if our local revenue doesn't increase, we need to be cutting services for our students in order to balance our budget. And we have a legal responsibility to balance our budget every year. Additionally, when our county executive goes to the media, without exception, he makes comments about supporting education and prioritizing education. I have a lot of information to share through the course of this presentation, and I'll allow you to draw your own conclusions at the end if that's actually the circumstance that we're experiencing in Harford County. So I'd like to thank everybody who has taken the opportunity to complete our budget survey, and also everybody who has or will be participating in one of our community meetings around the budget. Because this is such a different year. We have so many decisions to make, and none of them are going to be easy. So I want to walk you through a bunch of data and give you a sense of where we are with the budget decisions that are facing us. So let's jump right in. First, these are the priorities, these three priorities that are on the screen. I'll start with academic achievement with a focus on math, reading, and language arts. These are the three priorities the Board of Education set specifically for me in my evaluation this last year. And I think these are good goals. The second one, improve school environments with an emphasis on attendance and safety. And the third is increasing community and parental and guardian trust through partnership and transparency. Now, these three goals actually very closely align with three of our four Board of Education goals. The one that isn't included in the goals they set for the superintendent had to do with hiring a high-quality staff, which is our other goal in our strategic plan, is around human resources. But these are the three goals. These are the types of things that should be guiding our decisions as we move through this budget. So here's what's driving our budget. And these have changed. There are some new drivers in this year's budget. When you look at historic decrease in local funding, never in the history that we can track down has local funding gone down. That's partly because of the maintenance of effort laws that exist, but we are anticipating this coming year to still be a few $1 million below the funding we had in fiscal year 2023. Increased costs to maintain current levels of program and services. Again, very simply put, we've been experiencing inflation, as we do every year, and we've had a few years a little higher than others recently. And so costs are going up everywhere, and there's more than just costs. There's other circumstances that are changing that makes educating our students more expensive. That's in the rapidly changing, increasing student needs. I'm going to talk about where that's coming from. And then this idea of a need for competitive salaries. So one thing Maryland's blueprint has promoted is the starting salary for teachers of $60,000. Now, that sounded like a great idea about 7 years ago when this was being decided upon, but we've watched the market. Maryland isn't the only one approaching $60,000 starting salary. So salaries in every area have gone up. And frankly, that has been a big driver because we've sort of seen consistent increases over the last few years. Here is the challenge we have to confront. Essentially, just to maintain current operations, we need to find $60 million more to do the work that we're already doing this year and to continue that work next year. We're anticipating about a $12 million increase from the state. Again, that's an early estimate. That could change dramatically based on decisions that still could be made at the state level. But this $60 million really derives from a couple of key places. One is last year we assigned approximately $30 million of our fund balance to balance this year's budget. And what that means is we essentially took money from our reserves, put it in this budget, but the trouble with reserves is they're not a recurring revenue source. So in order to balance our budget, we're going to need to find another $30 million just to replace the reserves we used. Additionally, every year our salary package, because costs increase, so our salary package generally runs, it's been running between $15 and $20 million based on the standard salary package we've used the last couple of years. So that gets us to 45 to 50 million, and then we've seen increased costs, mostly in special education, but we've seen them in other areas as well, with insurance and pensions and things like that also going up. So that gets us up to the $60 million we need to find in order to be able to operate this district with the same level of services we have right now. So, we're going to come back to this theme many times through this presentation. In most cases, the money in our budget is represented by people. So today in this presentation, we're going to be talking about trade-offs. But we do not have $60 million anywhere in this budget that adds up to enough that isn't connected to individuals working in the system. Our average teacher cost is approximately now 9 to 10 teachers per $1 million. This is what $60 million looks like in positions. It's about 600. If we're looking at teachers, it's about 600 teachers. So let's talk a little bit about how we got here. Because again, there have been questions about how reasonable our ask is. Because we've been working to have a fairly consistent, reasonable request to the county. And for many, many years, it was very typical to request one amount and get a lesser amount. And then we had essentially 4 years where we received what we asked for. And we worked pretty hard to keep that in a reasonable space so it was growing reasonably. But the idea is if you slow down, if you stop supporting and staying on that track of regular, reasonable increases, you start to fall behind. This slide is a little bit of a mock-up because the top represents where we would be if starting 2 years ago with a budget, we had gotten, again, what the county has described as a reasonable increase. 5% is what we've discussed in other years is reasonable. We've had more than 5% for a few years in a row prior to the 2024 budget. Our FY23 budget, the local funding was $324 million. Had we been funded at a 5% increase, it would have been up to 340 in FY24. And then you can see the impact of the 5% increases if we had done that for this fiscal year, FY25, and if we were requesting 5% going into next year. We'd be at $375 million, again, where we could reasonably have been with 5% growth. That said, in FY24, we took a 2.9% decrease. We had a little correction in FY21. We went up 2.1%. But you see, we've been told to expect flat funding. And that flat funding is $321 million, which again leaves us about $3 million below where we were in FY23. But the difference, if we had stayed on a trajectory of somewhat reasonable funding, we would have had a much smaller gap to close. And it's probably something we could have done without all the concern that we have this year. But also without appearing so unreasonable as to ask for such a large amount of money. This is something we've shared the past few years, because what we're showing is the percentage of the county's general funds that have been assigned to schools. We know the school system is the largest element in the county budget. But no matter how you calculate the funds, right? So, I mean, we have three ways, because if we show this slide just one way, we've been told, oh, you're not including this, you're not including that. So we do it three different ways. No matter how you calculate the share, the school system's share of the county funds is diminishing. And this next slide, this is a new slide, I think that makes it even clearer. 2007, the gap was $235 million. We went back as far as we could in sort of the current funding data we have. Now, the gap between what the county spends on us and what the county spends on everything is $459 million. Again, the share is decreasing. And then, of course, you see those last little 2 years were the first time in the history that the funding for the school system goes down and flattens out. This isn't the school system driving the county government. This isn't the school system requiring the county government to raise taxes. This is the county government choosing to spend money on other things, setting different priorities. Another version, the same slide. This is the increase in revenue. Again, you see county revenue continuing to go up, except for a little dip last year. First time we've seen it go down, actually, since you have to go back into the aughts to find county revenue go down at all. But this is the very first time local revenue has gone down. Okay, so let's talk about what we spend all this money on and how we use it to serve students. This is a visualization, a very simplistic visualization of our budget. 87% goes to instruction and transportation. It's direct service to students. 10.5% goes to operations and maintenance, and then 2.8% goes to our central office administration. You see the dollar figures. What's notable is the ones on the right. Again, we're looking to close a $60 million gap. That's not going to be solved in those two areas on the right. There isn't enough there to cut out $60 million. Let me put this in perspective a little more. That white box, that's the size of a $60 million cut in this budget. Now, if we had a little interactive thing, we could move it around, and you could figure out what percentage is coming from each place. But no matter what we do, we're going to need to be looking in that big blue area for some portion of these cuts. And that is very difficult. This is not something that I think this community wants. I feel like we still have great needs in terms of some of the students we're serving. There is so much we could do. We've made good progress, but we still have things to address. And reducing those supports hardly seems like something that makes sense considering what we're confronting with some of our students right now. Let's put this in perspective a little differently. This is the breakdown of funds per pupil. So this is how the money flows to the student, kind of what proportion we're looking at. And again, putting this in perspective, it adds up to approximately a $1,500 per student reduction. Again, $60 million. We have to pull that out of our per pupil cost in order to balance this budget without the $60 million. So I talked a little bit about how costs have changed. So we know inflation. That's clearly a driver of costs. That has affected us in a number of areas. We also know salaries have gone up, partly because of the blueprint schedule we're on, but also because of market pressure, because salaries have gone up, in the region. And so that's one driver of increased costs. But the other is our student population. Our total enrollment has remained fairly flat. But special education students, students on free and reduced meals, and multi-language learners, English language learners, those populations have been growing faster than our general ed population. And all of those populations require additional resources to teach effectively. And so as we're seeing great growth in those three areas, again, we're trying to figure out how to do that on relatively flat funding. So here are some other changes. This is the reality in the last 6 years of positions in our district. You can see large numbers. It's administration over there on the left. We've added a net. And people can talk about, there's this position, that position. Yeah, we added 3.5 new positions in central office in the last 6 years. Others, we eliminated one and created one. We've done things like that. 96.6 in instruction, 271 in special education. Now, keep an eye on that number because, like I said, special education is really one of the biggest drivers of our budget. 12.5 in pupil personnel services, 47 positions in student transportation. Most of those student transportation positions, I would guess, are because of the growth in the special ed population. So that's actually connected to that special ed category. And then operation and maintenance, we've added positions there as well. You'll notice on the screen the purple apples. I'm not sure where you find a purple apple, but we have them here. Those indicate student-facing positions. So again, as we're looking at a budget, of course, we'll need to look at the non-student-facing positions, but there aren't many of them to work with. Another topic that we've discussed a great deal lately is safety. Again, since 2018, we have dramatically grown our expenditure on safety, and one could argue that we could or should be spending more there. Because like everything, it's still a trade-off. What we invest in, when we choose to invest in it. But the increase has been pretty dramatic in the last 6 and change years. 186.4% increase in expenditures on safety. So the next two slides, you're going to need some time to digest. So I'm going to go through them quickly, but I encourage anyone watching this to slow down on these next slides just to understand what we're looking at. One thing we want people to understand is that where we serve our students, costs are different for a variety of reasons. So the key here at the bottom, our programs, particularly in special education, Early Learners, Strive, and CSP, which stands for Classroom Support Program, those are specialized programs for students with special needs. And those programs actually are far more expensive than your general education programs. And so if a school has those, it changes a little bit. It affects their per pupil expenditure in the school. So on that screen, the blue, they're the only ones, those are the ones that don't have any of those programs. So those are our schools that don't have the specialized special ed programs. But then you also see Title I and community schools. Again, those are two other sources of revenue that some schools get, and those are designated at the federal and state level, essentially. And so you see those schools also have additional resources. And then all the way over on the right, you see our very smallest school. And you understand the scale of what it costs to run a really small school compared to, at the far left, youth benefit among our largest schools. Scale matters when you're budgeting. And so that's something, again, the differential in per pupil spending at each school is something that we need to look at and see if there's any adjustments we can make. Similar data for secondary. So this is middle and high schools. Again, you have the key at the bottom where we have our magnet schools. Again, those increase costs in the schools a little bit, but we also have Strive and classroom support programs in our secondary schools. The schools with the at symbol are our community schools, and those are designated through the blueprint. Those and then our Swan Creek School actually has two schools combined in one. It has the hybrid school, or what they call the blended learning setting, and the fully virtual. So we have a couple different delivery models. And in the blended, we have much smaller classes. So that's one of the drivers of the per pupil at that school. So the overall picture of our budget, this is kind of to summarize the major parts. So this is the combination of state and local revenue in our request. And what you see here is on the left side, the local revenue and the local revenue outside of Blueprint. So those two are actually combined in our local revenue. So those two add up to what our local revenue would be, but it captures what we're expected to spend on the Blueprint and then what's left over in our maintenance of effort that we have that's a little more flexible for us to use. Restricted revenue, it used to be that restricted revenue just represented grant money that came in, but now through the Blueprint, the state has chosen to restrict some things. So some of the money that's in the restricted accounts is money coming directly from the state. It's not actually grants in the same sense as you know them, but it is money that has to be spent for a specific purpose, which it was appropriated for. And then we have other revenue sources, but the $305 million, that really is our largest state part of our funding. So that's the big picture of our operating budget. We talk a great deal about fund balance. We chose to put a lot of detail here so people can see. One of the challenges is, depending on which report you're making, fund balance is calculated differently. And that gets confusing. The short version is, while someone can make assertions that our fund balance is over $80 million, 55 of that, 56 of that is already spoken for in one manner or another. Unassigned fund balance is the word we also use is reserves. And as I said early on, last year we spent approximately $30 million of our reserves. So you would see if we have 26 left, if we don't want to spend every penny of it, we're going to have to rely on something else for revenue, and that would either be cuts or new revenue. The Blueprint. The Blueprint is a driver of our budget. Really the biggest area. It's a driver financially, but one thing it's really done more than increase our costs, which it has done, but it's actually kind of tied up our money in a way. It's given us far less flexibility. I'm going to talk about it in a second. But we have been getting consistent increases from the state to address the Blueprint. The challenge there is nearly every dollar that comes from the state requires us to spend even more locally. So an example, we've seen career and college readiness as a blueprint pillar, and one of the things coming from that is dual enrollment. And the fact that under the blueprint, school systems are required to pay the tuition for students in dual enrollment. Now, we get a certain amount of funding for that, but we don't get enough to cover all the courses our students are taking. The blueprint also requires us to pay for advanced placement tests. Again, that's not something we had a revenue source. Again, the money doesn't cover what we're spending there either. There are a number of other examples. One thing in the blueprint, the community schools, that is fully funded by the state, so that's not driving our costs. But you do see an increase coming from the state, and it has to be spent on community schools. So that doesn't mean we can use it to fill our other gaps. So even though there's more money coming in, it's not like we have the discretion to direct it back to things we were already doing. So the county does have to provide minimum funding. The county is providing the money that the state determines the blueprint costs. But the thing is, that's replaced all the flexibility we had to do local initiatives, and that's something we've talked about quite a bit. So here's another way of looking at the funding. So state, there's a number on the left. The number on the right, you see the largest chunk in the bottom is what the state calculates is our local share for addressing the needs of the blueprint. So the blueprint very much passed on costs to the local school systems. And what that means is after we meet the blueprint requirements with that funding, that leaves us with about $78 million of what's left to address local programs, local needs, things that we value here that the blueprint doesn't address. So keep this picture in mind, because what we're going to talk about next is how special education is really driving our budget. And I would say, like I said, the blueprint's a driver, increased costs are a driver, but the increased costs in special ed far outweigh what we're seeing in other areas. So we are doing work in the system to focus on ways we might modify the work we're doing in special education. But one thing about special ed is the federal requirement for special ed is that you have a maintenance of effort every year. In other words, you can't reduce the amount you spend on special education per student one year over the next. So even though our special ed costs are increasing very quickly, we can't go in and cut programming from special ed because legally we can't reduce what we're spending there. So we're going to be looking to see if we can have a slightly different delivery model that maybe yields better results. And if there's ways we can move those funds around to do work a little differently. But that's something we're studying right now. But unfortunately, the funding that comes in for special education, as inadequate as it is, isn't something that can be something we look to reduce spending to help us address the budget needs. So here's part of our challenge. Most of the money we get calculated for special education, I think this was last year, $54 million is what they say we should be spending. What we're actually spending is about $115 million. Now, we're not unusual in this. Special ed funding has been massively undercalculated for years, and it's just an expectation that every school system is picking up a much larger chunk of the work to support students in special education with local funds. So if we go back to those two bars, you see how our local share, you have the blueprint, the local share doesn't change, but when you stick that gap, what we're picking up locally with special education funds into our remaining money, what it leaves us is about $15 million that we have total control over. And this is one of the challenges in the budget because, as I said, we have many programs that we have here in Hartford. Some of them are different from other places, and they're things that we value locally. But there's also many things that just aren't captured in the blueprint that can only really be funded through that area where we have some flexibility over the funds. So here's a different visual about how special education drives our cost. Our per pupil for students in different settings. A bit of a summary. So if our general education student costs about $17,000, depending on the level of services a student has, they cost quite a bit more. So there's an addition here. So a private placement, add $92,000 to $17,000, and that's about what we're spending per student who we send off to a private placement. Over the last 2 years, in part due to some legislation that passed 2 years ago, our placements, our private placements have grown dramatically. In fact, I think it was a $3 million increase last year, correct? And so this is another one of the drivers. But you can see by the category how much some of our programs cost. We're not alone in this, but this is a staggering change. Our special education population has grown by 14% just in the last few years. Our overall population has remained fairly level. And so the driver, so special ed's gone from 13.8% of our total our total enrollment to 15.6% of our enrollment. So again, as you saw on an earlier slide, that population's growing, and again, that's a population that costs far, far more to educate than our general ed students. So the budget survey. Many people have taken it. As of last week, I had read every comment that was in the budget survey, and it's evident that this budget survey got a lot of people's attention. There were a lot of negative comments about the survey itself, and the decisions are hard, and I think it was very emotional for people. And there are many, many suggestions in there, and so we will be working through that to see, what we can pull, what we can use to really help us make a difference in this budget. That, along with the community budget sessions we're doing, we need a lot of input about what's going to happen with this next budget. But we want to talk about why this year was so different. So as we know, we have a different budget year. But as I've shown in the earlier slides, cuts are absolutely unavoidable, and trade-offs are going to be required. So the whole budget survey is designed around trade-offs. And that's a hard concept because we like the work we're doing. We feel good about the work we're doing. We're getting results with the work we're doing. And so to eliminate anything is really hard to consider. So the question we're asking is, which would you rather? And we know that in most cases, anyone answering these survey questions is going to be saying, I don't want to do either. I don't want to do either. But here we are. Some examples of the trade-offs, if you haven't taken the survey yet, something I say every year in budget season: do we pay more people or do we pay people more? When you have a budget that is 87% people, that's the driver. You can talk in dollars, but really it comes down to how much are we paying the individuals, and then how many of them can we afford to pay? And so the salaries and the numbers of staff are really the very biggest variables in the budget. When we talk about the number of people, as you've seen in earlier slides, the student-facing positions are far and away the largest portion of our budget. Class size is kind of synonymous with, the number of people we have. If we have to cut people, class sizes go up. If we add more people, class sizes go down. We know we have to cut people. And so the question is, where are we cutting? Is it in services and programs, or is it in actual class sizes? We really don't have a choice. We're going to have to make hard decisions. And then invest in safety, invest in extracurriculars. That's not the only trade-off there. Again, you could probably put anything in either side of that. It's an example. These are hard decisions. Cutting safety is unconscionable with everything we've been confronting. But when you look at the other activities that our students have access to that cost funds, again, I think most people couldn't imagine cutting those either. So, this was similar to a slide we had last year. These are the types of things that we have to consider. These are all variables we can work with. And there's varying costs in these. And in fact, maybe the next slide will help tell the story a little better. Just to give you a sense of scale, again, class size, that is the biggest chunk in our budget. Transportation, if we were to do something with transportation, except for special education and homeless students, isn't required by law. Now, it is something that our community has come to expect. But that's one of the few places where there are tens of millions of dollars other than in the student-facing positions. We put English, language arts, and math. What those numbers represent there are the secondary teachers. In elementary school, the subjects aren't necessarily separated out. So this is talking about secondary teachers, because one of the questions in the survey asks, should we protect class sizes in those core areas? Or if we have to cut, do we cut everywhere the same? Or do we cut everything but language arts and mathematics to protect those because they're connected with a priority for the board? So those are really there as an example of the types of things we need to look at. And you can see, again, what flexibility we may have. I would argue at least a third of the comments that came in through the budget survey said cut central office. We know that. But again, we can close the entire Roberti building and only be a third of the way there. And there's probably some people who'd be for that, but when the paychecks don't arrive, they'll change their mind. Athletics, extracurriculars. Most of that budget is the $4.5 million on the slide. Most of that budget is around transportation. We also, a lot of the funding is, it's not a huge area. It wouldn't be huge savings, even to eliminate all athletics. It wouldn't be huge savings. We have one smaller, very small school on there. Frankly, we can't afford to close any schools, particularly elementary schools, because we're short on elementary capacity, but it's still a very expensive school to operate. So we have to ask some questions about, again, prioritizing. Is there a way to do things with a lower per pupil cost? And then safety and security. You've seen our expenditures on safety and security have nearly tripled in the last few years. Again, cutting safety and security strikes me as completely unconscionable, but you get to see the scale it has compared to other areas. Class size, the biggest variable there. This is actually using data from last year. These were real numbers, so we actually went in and calculated, we sort of went in and determined, okay, if we add one student per class, what does that savings? You see, it's not the same whether you're going up or down. And that has a little bit to do with just how the students are spread around our schools, the class sizes we see. It would be different in a different budget year, but it gives you a sense of where the numbers are. We have to increase class sizes by 3 students per class just to yield 1/3 of the savings we need. And of course, 3 per class doesn't spread out evenly because students aren't spread evenly among our schools. One school, 4th grade classes might be an average of 26. The next school, they might be an average of 29. So that's the reason you get numbers that don't add up exactly the same. But the point is, when we start talking about eliminating positions, when we accept the fact that there are not enough positions in other parts of the budget to take a meaningful proportion of what needs to be eliminated, this is what we're talking about. And I don't know how we get past increasing class sizes. So, one more slide after this. The whole premise of the budget is to support students. is to make our students successful. We know we have 250,000 people in town. We have 248,000 different opinions about how to do that. We don't always agree. And sometimes we don't agree because we don't have all the information. Sometimes even when we have all the information, we don't agree. I wanted to share this quote from our state superintendent. He said, "I believe it is our job as educators to set high expectations and use every tool we have to help children reach their greatest potential." One of the words in there I like most is tool. This budget is the tool that we draw on, that we use to help us serve our students. Again, academically, we're on a good trajectory, but it's a fragile trajectory. Because anyone working in schools can tell you the challenges we're facing, whether it's in our youngest students or our oldest students, whether it's behaviors, whether it's mental health, whether it's things coming in from the outside that are making it harder to educate them. We're seeing those challenges increasing. And we're also dealing with external factors like an ongoing teacher shortage, which has caused us to hire more people who are not fully certified. So one of the things that we've done in this budget over the last few years is do more to support our less experienced teachers. And putting those supports in place, I think, has been a big driver of why, despite these challenges, we're seeing the data go the right direction. And so anything we look at to pull back on how we support our staff is something that is going to have an impact. And I'm concerned about our ability to sustain the progress we've been making with the type of cuts we're looking at. So with that said, one last time, I want to thank everyone who's taken the time to complete the survey. The data will be used. We are looking, we're finding solutions, we're finding preferences for this community. And I also want to thank everyone who's participated or will participate in any way with our community work on this budget. This is a critical year, and I feel confident we can continue to succeed with our students, but we need help from this community. Thank you.